We are a dedicated think tank for the North of England. We were set up 16 years ago in recognition of the fact that the policy-making debate is very centralised in the UK. So I think the first thing I wanted to do was to think about what the sector was pre-COVID. And I think what we can absolutely say is that the voluntary community sector in the North of England is a really strong, vibrant force. And we know from the work that we have done that our estimates from the Northern Survey that we have at least 42,000 voluntary and community organisations operating in the North of England. The voluntary community sector pre-COVID was an integral part of our economy, an integral part of our community. It's the foundation often of the places in which we live, and it's often part of who we are, our actual identity in our communities, in our towns, in our cities, in our rural areas, and also I think in the North. In the North there's a very long and proud history of activism and contributions, not only in the North and nationally, but internationally across the world. We've had a major influence in terms of our activism and our community and voluntary spirit. And when we start to think about what might be the implications of COVID for the sector beyond, some of the work that we've done recently, we published a report in June, in September, which drew on the survey results from the last recession. And we were attempting to try and understand what does the last recession tell us about the sector's resilience and adaptability. And when we look at those results, it tells us that actually the voluntary and community sector has often been much stronger and more resilient than is often given credit for. And I think actually what we see in the results is that they show a huge amount of resilience under pressure, that they're often hugely adaptable and pragmatic, and in a crisis they batten down the hatches and they get on with it. And the other issue is that in our work we've repeatedly found that voluntary and community organisations in the areas of high deprivation are much more vulnerable financially than in other areas. And I expect, given the profile of COVID-19 and the disproportionate impact that it is having in areas of deprivation, that we would see that trend continued. That's the first thing, that the tone often can ring a little hollow given what we know in the sector about the stubborn nature of inequality, and that's on any metric that you want to look at: health, income, jobs. The North comes out worse in almost all of those metrics. But as Paul mentioned as well, we also have huge potential. We at IPPR North have talked a lot about that in terms of the fact that the North has a huge amount of economic and community vibrancy, and often not being given the oxygen in terms of investment and powers to actually make that work. A lot of the policy rhetoric at the minute overlooks the impact of austerity, which we think has been very significant, and I think particularly for the organisations that many of you work for. And there's not enough recognition that a one-size-fits-all will not work. And that we need to, at a fundamental level, we need to have greater trust and greater respect for the ideas and capacity of places at a local level. And the answer to this isn't necessarily more devolution, which is what we often say at IPPR North, that the answer to everything is devolution. Devolution's, part of the wider debate at the minute. The answer, I think, is just about a recognition that there is life beyond Westminster, that people do have ideas and people do have expertise that needs to be recognised in a much more holistic way going forward. And I think the other part of the answer is about the way that our democracy works, that we need much greater deliberation, much greater participation actively in the decision-making environment within our localities.
Crisis is not linear. And that, I mean, it's not in this crisis, middle, and then out of it, and back to some kind of old normal. And we're hearing a lot of that rhetoric, dominant narrative, we're in a crisis, linear, we'll get out of it. This is not a linear crisis, it's a roller coaster loop. Now, COVID, it's a stark reminder, isn't it, to how much the old economy's failed, and how it's failed us. Look at the inequalities like a couple of days ago. Look at that. Who's suffering the most? The poor, disadvantaged groups, and people like us in the Baltic. You've got to pick up it because we're not funding public services properly enough. This crisis, the importance of the everyday economy, of broadband, of food, of shelter and light. It's revealed that well-being and health is intrinsically related to the economy. Wealth equals health. It's revealed the indispensability of essential workers like nurses, people in the community and voluntary sector, is more important than property developers. It's revealed the folly of the agglomeration economics model, that people that have said, we'll get growth in our city centre and it'll trickle outwards and trickle downwards. And it's revealed the interconnectedness between us. We don't stand alone in this world. We are human social beings. Your task now is to actually take more control of the economy. It's to grow what you do, to fight what you do, to deliver more care, to deliver more things in the foundational economy, to get involved more in retail, to start getting involved in manufacturing, to start getting involved in the actual ways that the economy functions. The inclusive economy agenda that Salford's up to is the kind of things we should be doing. Community wealth building is what we should be doing. We need to get off our idea that we just fit in between the public sector and a little bit on the side. No, we are the new economy, and we need to get really active about that. Now, I know it might not be in your domain to think you should be activists, but I think you need to get activists. Who else is there? It's us and communities. We need to be activists now.
So I think I want to talk about, I think one of the things that we've made the mistake in the charity sector and the voluntary sector is to think that we are above society, not part of society. And I think one of the initial insights when I reached over to Akivo about a couple of years ago to think about what has now become the Home Truths work is to recognise how racism lives in society, and therefore racism lives in the charity and the voluntary sector, and how even though we have this self-image of being the good guys, we too have our problems to work through. Why I wanted to do this work a couple of years ago was that there was a lot, there was, and to some extent still is, quite a lot about the diversity agenda. And one of the things that is very clear to me and what that I felt needed saying is the diversity problem in the charity and the voluntary sector is not a diversity problem, it's actually a race problem, and it's a problem to do with racism. And I think unless we can make that connection, we can't really make the kind of deep and irreversible change and movement that we need to. We tend to discount the excellence that exists in racialized and minoritized organizations and that lives in the heads of racialized and minoritized people. And I think I don't just want to pick on funders, because that problem, that underlying fundamental problem, doesn't just live with funders. It is reflected in the voluntary and community sector more generally, the charity sector more generally. I think we have to recognise that the mainstream voluntary sector has not been a hospitable place for racialised and minoritised people, and the sector has not been orientated to securing racial justice and attending to the particular needs of racialised and minoritised people. We need to consider what if our sector is a site for harm and for trauma, and what are the implications of that, and what does that mean for what we need to do. We have to sit with our failure as a sector on issues of race and racism, and kind of sit in and with that uncomfortable idea. James Baldwin, who's just a genius, says not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. Talk about race and racism. We need to learn to talk about race and racism by talking about race and racism. And I think that is work that we need to continue to do as a sector. The role of the voluntary sector should be about restoring wholeness to society. And that means a relentless focus on social justice and equity, and racial justice as well. And I think what that means is serious corrective action, recognizing how issues of race, gender, class, geography, and so on limit the way that people can walk in the world. And so I think there is something about how do we hold on to this energy and ensure and insist that it stays with us as we reconfigure how we are as a sector,